In this session, we're going to ask the question, does God exist or did science kill him? It's important to note that there are two main branches of science, if you want to call it, or two types of science that we find in the world. The first one is experiential science. That's where they do experiments. That's where you want to go and you want to find out how much electricity goes through a computer and you want to run tests on that. Or how long will a battery last and you run tests on that. Or how long will a light bulb stay shining and you run tests on that. And you might take 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 light bulbs, run the tests over time, and then you will get all the information that you want. And then you can say with a high degree of certainty that this is the way that this specific light bulb works under these conditions. That's experiential science. The other types of science that you have, main branch, is forensic science. This is one where you are unable to run any tests because the subject matter that you're dealing with just doesn't lend itself to it. So for example, if you wanted to run a test on the initial conditions after the Big Bang, after the universe was created, how do you run that in a laboratory? How do you do something on that grand scale? What about a test on how the Earth's crust was formed? Or what about, where our moon comes from, how to create a moon? The problem that you sit with is it's very difficult to do these kind of things. They don't fit in laboratories. And especially when you look at things like the fossil record, for example, it's rather tricky because there's such a lot of challenges trying to find and gather information and data and then analyze this when it is in deep time. And this brings me to the next point, which is that science says nothing, but scientists do. So we have this perception that science is neutral and it's dispassionate. It searches for truth. People will make the statement, say, the science is settled. The science is settled for this specific thing. However, the science, which is the experiments and the data and the testing and everything subject to that, it doesn't say a word because it doesn't have a voice. It is the scientists themselves that interpret the data. And they are fallible human beings. They have agenda, they have biases, they make mistakes, and then we get differing results. Look at COVID, for example. Didn't they come out in the beginning somewhere and say, some countries said, no, masks don't work. And then they said to us, I think it was in the USA, masks don't work. And then they said, no, we need masks. And then they said, okay, we're going to get the vaccine. And they said, I don't know if we must trust the vaccine. And then they were like, no, you must trust the vaccine. And they said, because the vaccine will prevent transmission of the virus. Then it turns out that it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're not going to be able to transmit the virus, but it will protect you from severe illness and death, right? They said, once you've got this vaccine, you're going to be fine. We probably won't need any booster shots. Now they're saying, well, you need the booster shots. But how is this possible if the science is settled? Didn't all the scientists in the world have all the same information? Different countries responded to COVID differently, but I thought the science is settled. I thought everybody shared the same information. The reality is it doesn't work like that because it's the scientists and the communities and surrounding them, as in the political community and all the other doctors and everybody else that have their inputs into the system that affects the outcomes. But specifically, it's the scientists' interpretation of the data that affects things. Now, why do I mention this? Because if we ask the question, how old is the earth? How young is the earth? Which is often something that comes up in Christian circles. You have two competing arguments. But both of these arguments, both sets of people that propose these things have they use a certain set of assumptions with the same data, because the data is the same. It's not like they've got different data, right? So if you believe in an old earth theory, that person makes an assumption. They make an assumption that the speed of light is consistent. That's one of the assumptions that they've got to make. Is it a good assumption to make that the speed of light is consistent? Sure, it's a good assumption to make. Is it necessarily the case that the speed of light never changed? I don't know. The problem is if the speed of light, if its value has changed, it will affect a whole bunch of other things. Could God have created a universe in such a manner where the speed of light changed over time and now it's constant? I suppose anything is possible, right? But the question is, what can you prove? The young earth creationists, they, for example, will say, well, one of the reasons that we know that the earth is young is because of the amount of salt that's in the ocean. The argument goes like this, that essentially when the earth was created, there wasn't any salty oceans. But over time, salt has been deposited in the ocean. And if the earth was millions of years old, then the salt sediments in the sea should be such that we shouldn't be able to have life in it. Or what about on the old earth guys that say the earth is very old, right? They will go and they will date an object. They'll say this skeleton is so many million years old. They use radioactive dating to do that. Now, they assume that the decay in the radioactive dating is unchanged. It always functioned that way. That's built into the assumption in order for them to get those dates. But they have to assume it. Or let's say, for example, on the young earth creation side, there was a scientist that I read about that spoke about genetic entropy. He did very interesting studies on DNA, the decay of DNA and copying errors that occur between generations. And the argument that he made was actually quite sound, which was if mankind was millions of years old, right? The amount of copying errors that would have taken place would have meant that our DNA would have been unworkable by now and we would basically not have existed. All of these, the point of this is that all of these come with certain assumptions. And not all of these assumptions can be tested. That's the problem, specifically with the age of the earth. Like, how do you test the amount of salt in the ocean? How do you go back in time and test it? You can't. So just bear that in mind with this argument. In Psalm 19 verses 1 to 4, David writes the following. He says, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from the end. Yet their voices go out to all the earth. Their words to the ends of the world. David had this perception that you could know God's existence not just through scripture, right? But also through observing the natural world and specifically the stars and the universe out there. And that is what I'm going to talk about a little bit today, is the evidence for God based on the universe that we live in. You see, we live in a universe that came into existence from nothing. Now, for a long time, atheists and agnostics did not want to agree on this. They didn't want this because they knew the problem that they sit with, right? But in 2003, three scientists, Board, Greeff, and Vilenkin, put together a theorem, mathematical proof that basically said that no matter which way you spin this, the universe had to have had a beginning. They wrote the following. It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Vilenkin, which was one of the scientists involved with this, in an interview said the following. If someone asked me whether or not the theorem I proved with Board and Greeff implies that the universe had a beginning, I would say the short answer is yes. If you're willing to get into the subtleties, the answer is no but. So there are ways around having a beginning, but then you are forced to have something nearly as special as a beginning. Now it's fascinating because this is 2003, right? This is 2003. In Genesis 1 verse 1, it states, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What about other scientists? Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose, before Stephen Hawking passed away, said the following about space, matter, time, and time. They said almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself has a beginning at the Big Bang. But what could create something like this? Or let's say, what could cause something like this to happen? Right? Because if you think about it, at that time, matter, space, time, and energy all came into existence. So you would need a cause that operates outside of time, operates outside of space, operates outside of matter, that's incredibly powerful and incredibly intelligent and personal, right? To create what we have, what we see around us in the universe at large. You would need some being like that. Now the reality is that the only cause that we know of that can make things, especially complicated things, is intelligence. It's the only thing. If you want a Boeing 747 to come into existence, you're not going to have a tornado go through a junkyard and then by the time it's done there, have a complete built Boeing 747 filled up with a key in the ignition, good to go. You're not going to have that. You need intelligence to make it work. The only thing that we know, the only being that we know that fits this bill is God. And one of the reasons we can look at and we can say that this is the case is because the universe happens to be incredibly fine-tuned. In fact, it is so fine-tuned, it is balanced on a razor's edge. You see, without gravity pulling things together, we would not have planets and stars. Without the strong nuclear force, there would be nothing to hold the basic components of atoms together, so there wouldn't be any chemistry. Without electromagnetic force, you would not have bonding between chemicals. Without any one of these components, there would be no life as we know it. For example, the law of gravity is so fine-tuned that if you imagine a ruler that spans the entire universe, which is approximately 14 billion light years, which is divided, this ruler is divided into 1-inch increments. Each increment representing a possible setting that gravity could be. It just so happens that the setting is on the right one. And if the setting changed by only 1 increment, by 1 inch, either left or right, life as we know it would not be possible. You might get some life at a bacterial level, but not the complex life that we see today. What's more, gravity is one of at least 30 separate parameters that all are fine-tuned and need to work together in their own right to make life possible at all. So if we look at the universe, the mere fact that we have something that came out of nothing is an answer that a naturalist cannot explain. They've tried, but they cannot. They don't know how to get around that. The second thing is that not only do we have something that comes from nothing, but we also now have something that's so incredibly fine-tuned, it really looks like it's been designed. It is incredible. More than that, we find that we have life emerging from non-life. Now, when Charles Darwin wrote his book about evolution and the descent of man, the theory of evolution and the descent of man, his theory presupposes that the first organism was already there. Because remember, it evolved from something. But what created that first organism, if he's right? What created that first organism? What created that first organism, that first life, that everything then came from? Because remember, from his perspective, there's two pieces to evolution. There's change over time, or microevolution, which nobody disputes, creationists don't dispute that. And we've got macroevolution, the idea that a fly can turn into a horse, just given enough time. I'm exaggerating, but that's the idea. That's where the big challenge is. But even if we forget all about that, we have some very basic but yet profound problems that we need to solve, which is this. All life is built out of proteins. All life is built out of proteins. Proteins are made in little factories called ribosomes. Guess what a ribosome is made of? The ribosome is made out of proteins. Without proteins, You couldn't have a ribosome. But that's the problem. The problem is the ribosome is the thing that makes the proteins. How does that work? What's even worse than that is the ribosome wouldn't even exist without DNA. Without DNA, the ribosomes would not be able to build proteins. DNA is highly complex information. Where does the code come from? Where does the code come from? Nobody knows. Well, we know. It came from an all-powerful God that created the universe. And this God is outside of time, outside of space, incredibly powerful, and can create matter at will. So in conclusion, the world that we live in, specifically life on earth, is far too complex to just have jumped into existence from nothing without a cause. In fact, if we look at our 3 tests for logic, right? Is it logical? Is there data for it? And do we experience life that way? You would be visibly freaked out if you're walking down the street and something pops into existence in front of you. That is not the way that the world works. The explanation that fits the evidence best is that there is a superior, all-powerful, intelligent operator that operated outside of space and time and matter and created it all. How awesome is it to know that God is real, and through the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, we know that He deeply desires a relationship with each and every single one of us. See you in the next session.